Hey, hey, hey. Welcome back to Lunch with Lincoln for Monday, November 8th, 2021. We are 1 year away, Joe, today
Yep.
from Election Day 2022. I want to welcome my guest today, Joe Trippi, legendary Democratic strategist and host of That Trippi Show podcast, which you can find on Apple, Spotify, all your favorite places. Please do tune in. Joe, thanks for joining me today.
Good to be with you, Reed.
So, Joe, I want to talk a little bit about, and draw on your experience. A week ago, in the wake of a loss in Virginia and a close shave in New Jersey, the world was ending for Democrats come 2022. Just a few days later, Democrats pass a historic infrastructure bill, give President Biden a big win. And now it's okay. Next year is going to be tough, but there are green shoots. So take everybody through a little bit of like why, the psychology behind all this, like how you go from, the pit of despair to, a new dawn in just such a few days.
Well, I mean, first of all, as disappointing as New Jersey and Virginia were, it's a closeness. They were much better than they've been generally for Democrats. I mean, in New Jersey, the first time a Democrat's been reelected to the governorship in 40 years. That hasn't happened. It did happen. Sure, it was close, but you're fighting an historic trend and winning. And then in Virginia, you get to look. I remember when Obama was elected in 2008, and the reaction was Bob McDonnell, the Republican, winning by 14, 15, maybe even 19. It was a big double-digit win,
right,
for the governorship. Those swings are pretty big in Virginia, and this one was much, much smaller in a lot of ways. In the same time frame, 30, 40 years, there really hasn't been the party that's elected the president has always lost the governorship, particularly in the first term of the presidency. So, yes, it was close. Yes, when it's 2 points, there's a lot of looking at what could have been different, what could have been done different. Could McCall have done things differently? Could they have defined Youngkin earlier, which is something you and I think that could have happened, that would have won it. But I don't think it was half as bad as the media coverage, the salacious, sensational coverage of doom and gloom for Democrats was. And then, yes, immediately, I mean, the one thing you've learned, Obama went on to win re-election in 2012. So you get incentive. So I think, yeah, it's all changed because Democrats got together, came to agreement on infrastructure. And I think what's really something I've been talking about is, look, folks, this is what democracy looks like.
Right.
Two different people having different views, fighting it out, arguing about it. I want this in the bill. I want that in the bill. It's cost too much. It's not, doesn't spend enough on this. And they fight it out and actually find some consensus where there's disappointment on both sides, but compromise and get something done for the American people. And I guess the coverage of that is kind of weird because we had an authoritarian president who everybody bowed to and did whatever his party did, whatever the hell he said, and they still are doing it. But this is what democracy looks like, and I think it's a big win. I mean, there's a lot of things in that bill, and they're going to keep moving forward now. So I think it's a big step towards getting where people realize there was consensus. They've got things done for the American people. There's going to be bridges, airports, transportation. Charging stations, all these things that are going to create jobs and create a better future for America, I think is going to be pretty important. But they got to concentrate on what's happening in people's lives now too, though, and that's COVID and the economy.
Right, and I think it's also interesting to remember that we don't sometimes we our own myopia, right, our own nearsightedness, forgets a couple things about American democracy. One is that there's only two choices, right? In most races. So that, a lot of times, unfortunately, people choose the choice that they dislike the least, I guess, right? Secondly, is what I found fascinating, and again, I think that this is, everything is still up for grabs a year out from Election Day, is 13 Republicans voted for the bill, right? Which like, 13 Republicans maybe, but that's a lot for, in this current time.
Yeah, 19 in the Senate, I think.
Right. And the reaction from Republicans, especially conservative Republicans and conservative media outlets, is those people who voted to help Joe Biden, not the country, but to help Joe Biden, will be destroyed, will be primaried, you're done. Which is fascinating because these people finally actually did something. I'm not giving them absolution, don't get me wrong.
Right.
But they did something for the good of the country, maybe for the good of their district, right? Because they probably live in moderate districts. And now they will be destroyed by their own side, sure to be either replaced in a nomination fight or in Congress by someone far less even remotely normal or mainstream.
Right. And that's, again, the authoritarian thing of bowing to, from the top down, bowing and doing what one person wants. And if you don't, you're purged. Right. And that's, we're seeing that continue even with Trump not sitting in the presidency. So that's why I think the coverage of this, the infrastructure bill passes messy, democracy is messy. Well, democracy is messy. It's
right.
Arguing, it's debating, it's fighting it out, and then doing the right thing for the American people. And that may mean giving up on something you really wanted. And so those Republicans actually did that. They deserve credit for doing it. I've seen coverage like, people saying, well, without the 13, Biden lost 6 Democrats, and so he actually needed Republicans to pass his infrastructure bill. Yeah, well, that's how it's supposed to work.
Right.
It's not everybody in lockstep here, and the fact that the Republican Party writ large now is going to purge and attack the Republicans who actually passed pretty significant legislation that's going to impact the future of the country. I mean, in terms of not just jobs, but really, the roads we're driving on. Everybody knows how messed up our infrastructure is. It's the first investment in decades.
So let me ask you this. So, I grew up in D.C. You're sort of Beltway adjacent at this point. How do we convince those folks that are watching, the folks that listen to us, and the folks that we will work with, in coalition, that once in a while, it's a pretty good idea to break outside the Beltway bubble and look at what's going on in the world. Because as there's this reality distortion field that occurs in Northern Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C.
Right.
That has almost no relation to anything going on outside of it.
No, I think that's right. But secondly, I think, look, in the Beltway, I don't think there's an understanding of how powerful the rage machine that was built by Fox, Breitbart, the whole thing, how they are amplifying, the rage on the right against what Biden and these Republicans did, these 13 Republicans in the House. And I think it's impossible to overestimate that, and for some reason the Beltway underestimates it. They have to get out and I think do not understand that yes, debating about things that are that bridge is going to get built 2-3 years from now. There may be some jobs that start up relatively soon, but that people have real concerns because of the rage machine, maybe because of critical race theory being taught in schools and all these other things. You got to respond. You've got to be in tune with and hear what people are concerned about. Address the concern. It's not enough just to say, "Oh, it's not taught in schools." Those parents, be it because of COVID, their kids not being in classes. The Beltway needs to understand it's not enough to pass stuff for the future. We've got to be on top of what's happening right now, what people are concerned about today in their daily lives, and address it.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think we saw this in Virginia, right, which is at least enough people who were, maybe if it's 85,000 votes, how many of those people were Trump Biden voters, right? But we shouldn't lie. I mean, this is, our own admonition not to have a lack of imagination, which is a lot of those independents and Republicans, they came across the line because they couldn't stand Trump. They probably wouldn't vote for him again if they had the opportunity. But to your point, in a state race, state issues matter.
Right.
In Virginia, right, kids were out of school for almost 2 years. In New Jersey, right, the Republican candidate there just beat the drum on property taxes, right, which in New Jersey, if you add that to your income taxes, if you're a middle-class family, it probably feels like a crushing burden because it is. And so, I think that's the one thing you see is that a couple of things. One is don't ignore the issues that people are dealing with in their day-to-day lives. And two, disciplined campaigns with disciplined candidates often win.
Well, I mean, two things. One, I think Youngkin should have been defined earlier. I mean, the attempt late to define him as who he was, I think, came too late.
Well, and that's what I heard from a lot of my friends in Fairfax, Loudoun, Alexandria was by the time even we got in there, the problem was like, well, he's just not that guy. That's
right. We had to define him, all of us,
right.
Define him the day he won that nomination by moving so hard to Trumpism that, he had said and done a lot of things that he would continue to say in digital campaigning below the radar, but he should have been called out on it. And I think there was, some complacency. McAuliffe and Democrats, I think, thought McAuliffe can't lose because he was governor before. I think, that complacency and waiting to define Youngkin hurt. But Reed, you just hit something I think that's really important, and that is these are governor's races. Mm-hmm. And yes, there's going to be governor's races that are going to matter in 2022. But the races I think that are going to matter the most are holding up House races and Senate races in terms of the future of our democracy and holding on to it. And I don't think Youngkin would have won a race for the Senate in Virginia. I mean, the issues would have been different, and the what the Abbott law to ban abortion in Texas would have been front and center in a Senate race in terms of what does that actually mean. And I know Virginia very well. That isn't a place that was that would respond to that kind of threat, an attack on women's rights. So my point is, as we get into these Senate races and House races, yes, there's lessons to learn. I think one of the lessons to learn from Virginia is define if they nominate a Trump candidate, define them as such right away, so that they put on the sweater vest and start doing the I'm not one of them things like Youngkin was doing. They can't do it. And so that's one. I mean, there's plenty of lessons to learn, but I think if we learn those lessons, define them early, and the federal nature of the House and Senate races, I mean, in terms of the issues that are out there. And also now, in a lot of these places, hey, that bridge, the Republican voted against it.
Right.
It's on there's stuff now that got passed that these guys stopped and still want to take away from you. Is I think another powerful thing that we didn't have that McAuliffe did not have in the quiver, prior to the Virginia vote.
So let me ask you this. So staying on the theme of definition. So you mentioned critical race theory, which is not taught in schools, but it is a racial wedge, right? That's what it is. We saw Josh Hawley give this ridiculous interview to Axios, and I don't know why Axios did it, but maybe that's more Beltway bullshit, about how he's going to make masculinity an issue in 2022. Now, let me just say this: of all the guys who could make masculinity an issue, probably Josh Hawley not the guy, right? I'm just thinking that. Yeah. But this is going to be SB 8, right? The abortion law in Texas, as you talked about. As I think I said, my worst outcome to to stay with Texas, the legislator just asked Ken Paxton, the AG down there, to give a legal ruling on whether or not the state of Texas has to recognize same-sex marriage or perform same-sex marriages, because it's still, a ban on that is still in the Texas Constitution, right? All of this stuff is in my mind a plant to have these issues before the Supreme Court or whatever it is, front and center, whether or not it's a federal race or a state race. I mean, Joe, my opinion on, when we saw a few weeks back Pete Buttigieg being on parental leave was not about whether or not Pete Buttigieg and his husband should be on parental leave with new kid or kids. I'm not sure if they have one or two, but the pictures of two men having a baby, right? That was the whole fight. And so what would you say to, in your experience in the Democratic Party, what would you say to our friends and allies about how to combat this stuff? Because to your point, like saying it's not taught in schools doesn't matter, right?
No,
and one last thing is, with the right-wing outrage machine, we should not dismiss what I would call the osmotic effect, right? Some of it leaks out into the ether.
Right. No, Democrats have been, the whole time I've been out there, we've been horrible at fighting on the cultural war stuff. I mean, the Republicans, it's all they have tended to do. And they're very good at it. And they've got the propaganda machine to push it out there, the rage machine. And we tend to be very dismissive of it. Critical race theory, they don't even teach it in schools. Whatever the issue is, going back to Obama and the birther thing, who's going to believe that he wasn't born in America? No one's going to buy that. Well, yeah, so many people, because you didn't answer it, because you just let it fester out there, it got so bad that Obama had to show his birth certificate to prove it. And by then, people still didn't believe it, right? Because it's a forgery. So no, I think that's the other lesson here is we have to be stronger at coming out immediately and engaging on the culture war and calling it out for what it is. And it's also why I think the Lincoln Project is, from a Democratic perspective, why it's so important, because sometimes, in these races, a candidate doesn't have the money or he has to worry about defining themselves, or doesn't understand, as most Democrats, doesn't really understand how to fight back on this stuff. I think the Lincoln Project, one of the reasons I joined is thinking that, hey, we need somebody to throw the counterpunch on this stuff and help kind of like point the way. And I think that it was even proven more to me, I think, in the Virginia race, where it was clear we didn't have an answer for critical race theory. I mean, on the Democratic side, I mean, it's not enough to say, no, it's only taught in schools. If I had been advising the call-off, I would have said it won't be taught in school. It isn't taught in schools, won't be taught in schools when I'm governor. But I'll tell you what should be taught in our schools: history.
Right.
And our children deserve to know the truth and the truth of our history, and that it includes slavery. And go through and explain why we need to hit that critical race theory is a theory. History is history, and they need to be taught the history, and that's what at least address the concern, and then explain what you'll do. And I think that it would have been a better answer than hey, it's not taught in schools, don't worry about that. It's at Harvard, but nowhere else.
Also, when it comes to education, because we should assume that Republicans will make education an issue, right? One is that they hate public education generally. In a state like Kansas, right? They slashed public education so far that like schools can only stay open 4 days a week, right?
Right.
Who does that have an effect on? Kids, because they're not being educated. And as we all know, education is the one thing that no one can ever take away from you. And two, if you got a kid who's not in school on a Monday or Friday, who's that hardest on? Probably working class parents, right?
Right.
Because now they've got to either leave their kid home alone, which very few people, like my parents left me home alone all the time, but it was the 80s, right? Like latchkey kids were.
And look at what happened.
Look how I turned out, right? But, you should say, like, no, when kids go to school, they learn to read, they learn to write, they learn math, and they learn history, geography, all the other things that sort of make a well-rounded student for whatever it is you want to do, right? Whether or not it's, if it's going into the building trades, if it's going to be a teacher, if it's going on to college, whatever it is, that by the time, that student reaches the 12th grade, they've got the skills necessary to go out and be a successful person, whatever it is they choose to do with their life, right? But I think that, this is one of those where, like, Democrats cannot and should not let Republicans off the mat, because, J.D. Vance just said the other day, like, he basically thinks, professors should be locked up. This is a guy, by the way, Joe, who went to Yale, right?
Yeah. And who will put on the sweater vest the second he gets the nomination after saying crap like that to get the nomination and to stand in the general in a way that they can, like Youngkin, they'll still be doing the stuff under the radar with mail pieces and digital advertising. And the TV will be all smiles and warmth, and it's all bullshit.
But what do Republicans run on next year? They don't believe in anything, Joe. They don't want anything to happen, right? Like, it's this. It's nihilism, right? In a Patagonia vest.
Well, I think that gets back to Democrats being able to run on, we've done this. They want to take it away, or they're going to vote against it, particularly in the next package. The family leave. I know we're pay family leave. We're still looking at whether that'll be in this package or whether it'll be a standalone. But the members of Congress, these Republicans voted. A lot of them voted to give themselves weeks and weeks of family leave. But then they'll be voting against giving it to the American people, the working people out there. So
isn't that always the irony, right, Joe? Is that Congress has taken like the next 2 weeks off, right? Like, okay, there's parts of it, right? As my vestigial Republican self says, the less those folks are around, maybe the least harm they can do. But to the average person who's whether or not it's family leave, whether or not it's gold-plated healthcare. Whether or not it's, basically they're still allowed to use insider information to make a bunch of money on stock trades, right? It sort of continually separates the ruling class and the oligarchy from regular folks who are trying to keep their kids in school, keep their grandmother healthy, keep a job. And I think the other part too is, I don't know if you've seen this, but, talking to a lot of my friends who, they either are employers, they are employees, they work in private sector businesses, that a lot of new hires, or potential candidates are demanding these things on their own. They're like, I'm not coming to work there. My wife and I, or my husband and I are planning to have a baby. Like, I want my 6 or 8 weeks off or whatever it is, or I'm not even going to consider the job. And people are like, well, I've been without this person for like 6 months. Like, I need the person. So it feels like, shock of all shocks, Joe, like the market economy is sort of finding its way to where the people want it.
Right. Exactly. That's exactly right. And again, I think the Republicans are misjudging and out of touch with. This is what case where they're out of touch with what people want and are gonna say no to it. Why I got like you said, it's just sort of like the no party or the authoritarian, anything that helps them on their authoritarian march, fine, but everything else, forget about it.
That was one thing. Joe, you and I were on the road last week talking to some folks, and I had this thought as we were talking, and this is probably not a great message for voters because it takes too long. But, the thing about life is it's arbitrary, right? As much as we don't want to believe it. I could walk across the street and get hit by a bus. That could happen. Not likely, but possible.
Right. Yeah.
In a democracy, we make the compact collectively to try and reduce the arbitrary nature of life, right? That we understand that some people are going to do better than others, that there's a lot of times that folks are in those positions through no fault of their own, but also that they should not be penalized as such because of that, right? In an authoritarian movement or regime, every moment of every day is arbitrary because it's all based on a power dynamic, which is a very few number of people are in charge. The vast majority of people have no agency, have no voice, at any moment you could get a knock on the door and you know what it means, right? And that's, to me, I think sometimes we don't talk about the, we say authoritarian, we say autocracy, but we don't explain it. We don't make folks illustrate it enough.
Right. Well, it's all top down, fealty to the leader, kneel, bow, do what the leader says, which we're seeing pervasive throughout the Republican Party, even when Trump's not the president, not in power.
Right.
And the problem with that, in practical terms, is every power then for everybody else is proximity.
Right.
So, the airline CEO that's closest to the leader, that airline probably going to do pretty well.
Right.
The rest of them are going to have all kinds of problems, right? Inspections, anything to help the guy with proximity to the leader. So, that's not how. That's why I'm still sort of blown away sometimes about corporate America, not understanding that it's not in their interest to let this keep going on. This is not give to both. We're not in this give to both sides world. Let's have lobbyists work both sides and let's stay out of this stuff. That's like how things worked normally. But now you have this authoritarian movement. You're actually contributing to the downfall of democracy in the country, in my view. And ergo, running the real. There isn't a place where there's an autocracy where business has done well at all. In terms of it's going to cost jobs, it's going to cost the economy, and it's going to destroy a lot of companies out there.
Well, right, and we don't have to get into a discussion about regulation or anything like that, but in an authoritarian regime, there is no small business really. Right. Except for those that are allowed to flourish, right? The sort of innate entrepreneurial spirit of Americans, which is now all I need is a phone and a good idea to start a business, right? That's all out the window.
Yeah.
You think regulation's bad now, folks? Wait till it's like a bunch of, otherwise unemployable goons making decisions about this stuff. Because as you know, Joe, and as history has taught us, those are the people that rise to, to the top of those things, are the people who are willing to be anything at any time. To be as close to, as you said, to the proximity of power.
Well, it's corruption at that point, and everybody with their hands, in everybody's pocket as it goes up the food chain to the leader. That's what the whole autocracy thing is about.
Well, listen, Joe, I want to thank you for your time today. Again, folks, remember to tune in, rate 5 stars, download That Trippi Show on your favorite podcast app. Also, tune in to the Lincoln Project podcast hosted by yours truly. Drops Tuesdays and Thursdays. Joe's been a guest many times, and so thank you for that. And everybody remember that we do Lunch with Lincoln Mondays and Fridays at noon Eastern. And please check out LPTV Tuesday and Thursday night, The Breakdown with Tara Setmeyer and Rick Wilson at 7 Eastern. And we're speaking with Lisa Sinecal and Maya May, also at 7 Eastern. Joe, want to thank you again. Everybody out there, remember the fight continues. It is late, but it is not lost. Sign up lincolnproject.us or follow us on social media. It's going to take all of us, gang. Joe, thanks again. And everybody have a great week.
Thanks for having me, Reed.